Hi guys, and welcome to this Chemistry 1.4 Aspects of Selected Elements video. In this video we're going to be covering the basics of the knowledge that you're going to need to know in order to do this external. And as you can see, the topic of this video is about atomic structure. So in this video we're going to be covering some foundational knowledge, including the structure of an atom, the structure of an ion, and what the difference is between an atom and an ion. Hopefully by the end of watching this video you'll feel comfortable in answering these 5 main questions or learning objectives. So first of all, hopefully you recognise that this is a periodic table here on the left. So when it comes to thinking about the periodic table, we need to know what a chemical element actually is. A chemical element is made from lots of atoms that are all of the same type. And as you can see, the chemical elements are actually arranged on the periodic table. So now that we know what a chemical element is, what is an atom? An atom is the basic building block or unit of ordinary matter. So everything that you see around you is made up of lots and lots of atoms. And it's important that you know that atoms are particles that don't have a charge. And this is something really important that you need to remember for later in this video when we compare atoms with ions. Atoms join together in order to form molecules, and these molecules make most of the objects that you can see around you. Atoms have a particular structure, and you can see the structure of a sodium atom here on the right. It's really important that you know that atoms are made from 3 types of particles, these being the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons. And you can see these all on the diagram on the right, where you can see the protons and the neutrons sitting together within that central nucleus, and you can see those electrons sitting in ring-like structures or shells out from the nucleus. So let's take a closer look at each of these 3 types of particles within an atom. Let's first focus on protons. So protons are the positively charged particles within an atom. And as you can see from our diagram of a sodium atom on the right, these positively charged protons are located in that central nucleus. Perhaps one of the most important things that you need to take away from this slide is the fact that the number of protons in an atom tells us which chemical element it is. So let's take a closer look at what this means. As we said before, we know that the periodic table contains all the different types of elements that humans have discovered. The important thing for you to realise is that there's all these different types of chemical elements and they're all made from atoms. So in the element nitrogen, it's all made from nitrogen atoms. However, the important thing that you need to realise is that the atoms for a particular chemical element have a unique number of protons. So all the nitrogen atoms have the same number of protons, but this is a different number of protons to the amount of protons in an oxygen atom. And as you can see on the periodic table, elements are actually arranged by the number of protons in their atoms. So when it comes to looking at this periodic table, you can see that in the top left-hand corner, there is a small number above each of the chemical element symbols, and this number is telling us the number of protons in the atoms of this chemical element. So first of all, we can see that hydrogen up here has a little 1, which means there is 1 proton in a hydrogen atom. Over here, looking at helium, we can see there is a 2, which means there are 2 protons in the helium atoms. Going down here to look at lithium and beryllium, we can see that lithium has 3 protons in its atom, whereas beryllium has 4. And going across, we can see that boron has 5, carbon has 6, nitrogen has 7, and so on. So as you can see, moving along the periodic table horizontally, the number of protons in each of the atoms of the different chemical elements increases, and it actually goes all the way up to well over 100. And in chemistry, we have a special name for the number of protons within an atom of a chemical element, and this is called the atomic number. So you need to know the atomic number is the number of protons within an atom. And as you can see on the periodic table, the little number in the left-hand corner above the chemical element symbol is the atomic number. So we therefore know that the atomic number of lithium is 3 and the atomic number of beryllium is 4, and so on. So now that we've talked about the protons, let's take a closer look at the neutrons. So the important thing for you to realise is that the neutrons are the neutrally charged particles within an atom. As you can see on the diagram, the neutrons are located in that nucleus right in the middle of the atom, and they sit there with the protons, as we saw before. Finally, let's have a closer look at the electrons, the last type of particle that exists within an atom. So electrons are the negatively charged particles within an atom. And as you can see, these electrons sit in the shells or the ring-like structures that surround that central nucleus. So they're not in the same place as the protons and the neutrons. They sit outside the nucleus in these ring-like structures that we call shells. Ultimately, because electrons are negative, it makes sense that they're attracted to the positive protons which sit in the nucleus, and that's what helps to keep them in this ring-like structure that you can see in the diagram on the right. Atoms are neutral. They don't have a positive or a negative charge, they are neutral, and therefore it makes sense that the amount of positive charge in the atom, or the number of protons, is going to equal the negative charge within the atom, or the number of electrons. And so this rule that the number of protons equals the number of electrons within an atom is something important that you're going to need to know for your exams. So let's take a closer look at the electrons. As you can see in the diagram on the right, there are different numbers of electrons sitting within the shells around the atom itself. And so here are some important rules that you are going to need to memorize for your exam. You must know that in terms of the arrangement of the electrons in the shells around the nucleus, the first shell always has up to 2 electrons in it. It will have only 1 if it's hydrogen, because hydrogen only has 1 proton and therefore only has 1 electron. But for all the other atoms of different chemical elements, the first shell always has 2 electrons, and we can see these here and here in the sodium atom. After this, you need to know that the second shell around that central nucleus can have up to 8 electrons within it. It can have 1 to 8, but the maximum number that it can have in that shell is 8 electrons. And we can see here that sodium has 8 electrons. We typically show these as sitting in pairs around the central nucleus like this. So they're not evenly spread out around the ring, they sit in pairs at the equivalent of 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock on a clock face. And the reason for this is that the electrons have like charges, so they're all negative. And as I'm sure you know from magnets, 2 negative charges, which are the same, repel or want to be as far apart as possible. And that's why these 8 electrons are arranged like they are on the sodium atom. The 3rd, 4th, and even 5th shells will each have up to 8 electrons. So looking at our diagram of sodium, we can see there's only 1 electron sitting in that outermost shell. And there's a special name for the outermost shell of electrons. And this shell is called the valence shell. And any of the electrons that sit in that outer valence shell are called valence electrons. Another important piece of information you need to know for your exams is that when an atom has a full outer valence shell, this means that the atom is more chemically stable. So now we need to take a closer look at ions. So what is an ion? Well, you need to know that an ion is an atom that has an overall electric charge. So it's different from an atom because an atom doesn't have any charge at all. And the reason that an ion has a charge is due to the loss or gain of electrons from those shells that we just looked at. Atoms ultimately gain or lose electrons in order to form an ion with a full outer shell, and as we talked about before, we know that this means that they become more chemically stable. It's important that you know that as part of your resource booklet, included within this is a table of ions, which shows all the ions you need to know for your exams and their charges, and this is shown here on the right. When we're thinking about the structure of an ion, you need to know that an ion has the same number of protons and neutrons as its atom. However, in order to gain a charge, we know that it has to either gain or lose electrons. So when an atom loses in electrons, those negatively charged particles, it forms a positive ion. And that's because there are more protons than electrons. So there's more positive charge than negative charge. So looking at our table of ions, here are the positively charged ions that you can see, where you can see these positive ions can either have a positive 1, positive 2, or positive 3 charge. Alternatively, we know that atoms can gain electrons, and when they do this, they form a negative ion because there is more negative charge than positive charge. And these are shown here on the table of ions, where you can see that these negative ions can have a negative 2 or a negative 1 charge. So let's go through some examples together. So as we saw before, sodium has an atomic number of 11, which means that it has 11 protons and 11 electrons. And when we draw the atom itself, it looks like this. And we're going to learn how to draw atoms in the next video, so don't worry about that for now. So as you can see, in that first ring of electrons, there are 2, in that second ring, there are 8, and in that third ring, there is only 1. So in order to form a sodium ion, we need to lose this outermost electron, like this. And in doing so, we then form a sodium ion. And as a result, because we've lost an electron, this means that we're going to have more protons than electrons. And this gives our sodium ion a positive charge. So now let's have a look at a negative ion. And an example of this is oxygen. So as you can see, oxygen has an atomic number of 8, which means that it has 8 protons, and because the number of protons and electrons is equal within an atom, this means that the oxygen atom is going to have 8 electrons, 2 sitting in that first shell and 6 sitting in that next shell. Ultimately, this oxygen atom wants to form a full outer shell, and in order to do this, it's going to need to gain 2 electrons to bring that outer shell up to 8. And this means that our ion for oxygen gains 2 electrons like this, and as a result, there are 2 more electrons than there are protons. And as a result, this means that the oxygen ion has a negative charge of -2. So now that you've watched this video, you ultimately need to know what an atom is, and you need to know that atoms are made from protons and neutrons sitting in that central nucleus, and electrons, which sit in the electron shells surrounding the nucleus. You need to know the definition of an ion, that it's an atom with electric charge due to the loss or gain of electrons, and you also need to know in terms of the structure of an ion that they have the same number of protons but different numbers of electrons compared to their original atom. Thanks for listening.